I have been thinking about an issue, so I want to share that first, which is related to last week's issue where I talked about the evolution of my environmental philosophy. And I've been thinking a lot lately about how wrong the conventional today's environmental philosophy is. And I think it's even more wrong than I said last week. And I think it's really important for us to understand that essentially we've all been taught a way of thinking about our environment that is deeply destructive to our lives, in that we're taught to think about our environment in a way that when we pursue it, when we pursue the idea of saving the environment or protecting the environment or whatever form it takes, we are actually hurting ourselves and certainly hurting a lot of other people. So I thought what I would do is I want to talk about what I think the proper view of environment is, and which is really more or less the classical view, and then discuss the contemporary view, which I think is a destruction of the proper view of environment. So this may be a little bit technical, but well, maybe to make it a little bit less technical and maybe even more relevant, I just want to make an observation about the world that certainly comes up whenever I'm looking at a lot of news, which is that whatever is the case with CO2 and how much CO2 impacts the world in a way that's dangerous, there is just an insane devaluation of abundant, reliable energy. So when I'll give you a couple of examples. One is I'm reading this book called The Madhouse Effect by Michael Mann, the climate scientist who's a popularizer of climate science, but more broadly as an advocate and activist in terms of certain kinds of energy and environmental policies. And I'm in the section of the book where he talks about the negative impacts of fossil fuels via quote unquote climate change on all sorts of areas of life. And he talks about food and security and water quality. And he does not mention energy as valuable in any of these contexts. So basically, the way it comes up is it essentially amounts to we depend on a good climate, a good, stable climate, the climate we inherited for like a lot of food and for a lot of security and for clean water. And I'm just thinking, what planet are you living on? I'm going to answer that in a minute, what planet he's on, because he's not actually on the he's not actually looking at the planet in the proper way. So he only sees a certain part of it, which is the part that humans have impacted that he thinks is bad. Or from a certain perspective, and I'll explain this more in a minute, but he's looking at the planet in terms of what are the parts of the planet that we haven't impacted and should impact. And he thinks, oh, that's the source of all good in the world. And therefore he's focused on, okay, how does the unimpacted environment benefit us in terms of, food and security and water and everything else, every kind of prosperity. But he's looking at it totally from the perspective of here's how we depend on the environment, the unimpacted climate to provide us with these things. He doesn't talk at all about how abundant, reliable energy makes these things possible. And yet, if we look at food, our ancestors had completely unstable access to food in part because they didn't have abundant, reliable energy. And they had completely unstable access to any kind of good drinking water because they didn't have abundant, reliable energy. And they had horrible security in part because they didn't have abundant, reliable energy. So to talk about these values, but to not talk about the role of abundant, reliable energy in these values is uh, incoherent in a certain way. It's just you can't talk about them. So you might think, okay, well, this is a climate scientist. He's somewhat understandably focused on the role of climate and particularly the unimpacted climate, the so-called natural climate, on these values. But I notice this devaluing of energy even when I read energy people. So, for example, there's this daily thing we read at our company from Axios. It's this Axios energy update, and it's supposedly about energy. But I can't remember. Now, I don't read it comprehensively every day, but I don't remember one day where there was any kind of enthusiasm about the role of abundant, reliable energy in life. And I don't remember any significant concern for the fact that billions of people lack abundant, reliable energy. So there's something really off. It's not just, you can't just say, oh, they're so concerned about CO2, because even if you're so concerned about CO2, you have to recognize that abundant, reliable energy, that's the foundation that took us from a life expectancy of 30 to 75 or 80. So if you care about human life, you can't ignore abundant, reliable energy. And yet everyone is always ignoring the value of abundant, reliable energy. So what is going on here? And my basic answer to this is that people have been taught an environmental philosophy that devalues human life, including the need for abundant, reliable energy. So I want to summarize my view versus the conventional view. And my view I think of as really the classical view, maybe a little bit modernized version of it. And so here it is. My environmental philosophy is that we should enhance, and all these words are important, we should enhance the human environment through human impact. So we should enhance the human environment through human impact. And today's view is that we should save the non-human environment from human impact. So it's enhance the human environment through human impact versus save the non-human environment from human impact. So let me go into what I think is the right view in terms of how we should think about environment and why I talk about the human environment. So for any organism, an environment is its surroundings. It's really every aspect of its surroundings that affect the length and quality of its life. So a dictionary primary definition is something like the surroundings or conditions in which a person, animal, or plant lives or operates. And a decent synonym is habitat. So, the mosquito has an environment, the snail has an environment, a bear has an environment, and it's all about its surroundings as it affects that organism. And there are different degrees of that. Like there's a more local environment, and then there's a global environment, as in ultimately like the global ecosystem and the solar system and the galaxy. But ultimately, you're looking at it as how good is this environment for this organism to flourish? And it's very, very important to have a good environment. And thus, when people talk about the environment, it has a lot of moral value because you need a good environment. You need an environment conducive to you in order to flourish. So it's legitimate that people have a lot of value attachment to it if they think of it in the right way. So from our perspective, our environment, we can think of as the human environment. And the key thing about the human environment that's ignored is that it consists not only of man-made surroundings, but also of man-made surroundings. And these go together very much. So it's often people talk about the environment and they're just talking about things that are not man-made or that they think shouldn't be impacted. But really our environment is everything around us, whether we made it or not. So when I think of environment, I think of the human environment. I think of trees and oceans and dirt. And I also think of buildings and farms and factories and water purification plants and roads. And I think of all of these as these are part of our environment. Now, some of them came from human causes, and then some of them came, like we didn't create the oceans, but increasingly we are impacting things in different ways. Like we add CO2 to climate, which is people make points of that, but there's also our ancestors had enormous changes on wildlife, like making the mammoths extinct, and I think that contributed to forests growing. And we remove contamination from different bodies of water, and we move different animal populations to certain places, and we try to destroy certain organisms that threaten us. So we are dramatically changing the environment and ecosystem to become more human. So when I think of environment, I think of it as very much our surroundings, and I want those surroundings to be as good as possible for us. And I consider our environment to be both the things that we make and impact and also those that we don't. And I'm totally okay with the fact that more and more of our surroundings we are having some sort of impact on. And the reason, as I discussed last week, is that nature doesn't give us the environment we need to flourish. So to have a healthy human environment, we need to continually enhance our environment. And that means add roads where roads weren't added and add buildings where buildings weren't added. We want to intelligently impact or intelligently uh, transform it. And these are generally good things. Good things by the standard of human flourishing. So when I talk about the human environment and human flourishing, those concepts are very closely, they overlap a ton, because ultimately so much of human flourishing is just that we've built a world that materially allows us to flourish. So I think it's really important, though, that we view our environment not as just the things that we don't affect, but and this idea that we shouldn't affect them, we should view our environment as our whole surroundings. And part of one concept that comes up here is the concept of natural, which is people think of, well, humans are unnatural and then everything else is natural. And I think we could talk about human and non-human, but I don't like the idea that human beings are unnatural, particularly when natural is viewed positively, because I think of us as the best part of nature. So I've used this line before, but I think if Martians were looking at the planet, they wouldn't say, oh, those buildings are unnatural. They'd say human beings build the best nests. And when a beaver builds a dam, we don't think of it as unnatural. So the environment around us is including all the things that we've made are good. Or rather, they are natural, and they are generally designed to improve our lives, and many of them are good. So human beings have enhanced the human environment in many ways, and sometimes it might make sense to draw a distinction between what we impacted and what we didn't, but in general the way we want to look at it is what in our environment is improving human flourishing and what isn't. And if you have this perspective of enhance the human environment as the environmental goal, then industrialization becomes this huge overall positive. Because what is industrialization? It's basically the use of high energy machines to intelligently transform the human environment. It's to make it a better environment for human flourishing, and that's been tremendously beneficial, as evidenced most of all by the fact that we have much higher life expectancies because we've created an environment that's much more conducive to human flourishing. We've taken the human environment and we've made it overall better and better and better. Now, interestingly and tragically, industrialization is viewed as environmentally negative. And industry is usually viewed as anti-environment. There's a conflict between environment and industry. And that comes down to the concept of environment has been deeply perverted, because instead of people thinking about environment in terms of the human environment and wanting that to be better for human beings, environment has come to mean something like the unimpacted environment or the non-human environment. So when people are talking about the environment, they're referring to the parts of our surroundings that are not impacted by us and they believe shouldn't be impacted by us. And this has so many implications. And it really comes down to, I mentioned that Michael Mann is living on a different planet. It affects totally how he looks at the planet. So when he's thinking about the environment, he is thinking about the environment. It's a huge value, which the human environment is a huge value, but the non-human environment is not a huge value. That's actually, if you think of the unimpacted environment, that's an anti-human environment. If we don't impact the environment, it has many anti-human elements to it. But when he's looking at human impacts, all he's looking at, or fundamentally what he's looking at, is how are we changing the environment? And the idea is it's wrong to change the environment. So when he's looking at the environment from that perspective, he can only see negative things. So it's, for example, when he looks at fossil fuels and the historical role of fossil fuels, he sees nothing environmentally positive because he's been trained to not look at human impacts as potentially positive. Just human impacts are always negative. So those get no moral significance. So even though human being life expectancy has doubled, that has no significance in terms of how he's thinking about environment. And environment is really the top value that he and many other people are thinking of. And at the same time, when people see any kind of impact on the non-human environment, so they see more CO2, they think immediately, okay, this is inherently wrong because we're not supposed to impact the non-human environment. And then they also have a tendency to dramatically exaggerate negative consequences to humans. And this goes to another part of the philosophy. When your whole ultimate value is the non-human environment, one of the justifications for that, if you're a human being, is this idea that the planet is a delicate nurturer. So this idea that all the whole ecosystem is interconnected and we're all delicate and fragile and we all depend on not changing anything. And therefore the idea is, well, if we impact this delicate nurturer, this delicate ecosystem, then of course it's going to be bad for us. But this becomes a dogma. It's basically like saying, well, if we anger this God, of course it's going to punish us. But in reality, this delicate ecosystem needs to be dramatically changed to improve our lives. And and there are many ways in which we can impact it that won't hurt our lives and in fact will help our lives. And maybe sometimes we impact it in a way that might hurt us a little bit, but is more than made up for uh, by the benefits. Like historically, coal decreased air quality for some people, but overall made their lives way better. So if you're thinking about environment in human terms, you see something like coal and you say, oh my gosh, that's made the human environment so much better. And but if you're an environmentalist, if your whole focus is on the non-human environment, all those benefits to humans don't matter environmentally. All that matters is that, oh, we've impacted the environment and that's bad. And we expect, because of our dogma of this delicate nurturer, that it's going to be bad for human beings. And I see this pattern just everywhere in the culture because our ultimate value is the non human environment. And we have this dogma that the non-human environment is our delicate nurturer. We just ignore all of the massive benefits of impacting the non-human environment, and we assume that any impact is going to be catastrophic for our lives. And I'm curious what listeners think and what you guys think, because when I look at it in this way, I just see, oh wow, this is why people are just not seeing reality, because they're so focused on this non-human environment as the goal, and viewing impact as bad. And so yeah, if that's your goal, you can't even really see all the benefits to the human environment of impact because you're not looking at the human environment as part of environment. And then also you're always going to have this assumption that, oh yeah, sure, if we impact is bad, and of course it's going to be bad for human beings. Of course nature is going to bite us in the ass. And thus you have people for centuries thinking, yeah, industrialization is going to make our lives worse. Of course it is. It's going to, and particularly the last 50 years, and it keeps getting better and better. And yet the dogma doesn't change because the environmental philosophy doesn't change. There's still this view that, oh yeah, the proper environmental philosophy is we need to save the non-human environment from human impact, and versus, oh no, that's not the goal at all. If you care about human flourishing, you want to enhance the human environment through human impact. So yeah, I'm curious what listeners think. Also curious what Don and Stefan think. Any comments from you guys on how you think this perspective infects people's thinking?
I think there's some like naive logic to it because in many circumstances we use sort of a natural background standard as a safety standard. So for example, if you let's take ionizing radiation. So we are constantly bombarded by our natural environment um, with ionizing radiation. So each and every one of us gets a bit of radiation right now from the universe, from the stones around us, from the earth, from maybe the atmosphere even. And so you can say, well, we have a certain level of radiation around us, and we know that our bodies are sort of adapted to this, like from an evolutionary perspective. So this is definitely a safe level of radiation. But then you have to acknowledge that we are modern technology humans, and we can go deeper and think about like, yeah, that's definitely a sort of a safe background level that we know of. But we could like, what can we measure? How can we assess what also would be a safe threshold for that. So, for example, can we work in a nuclear power plant? And we definitely can. So people don't get a big cancer risk from working at a modern nuclear power plant. And on the other hand, there are some things that are sort of natural background variables, but that might still be a threat. And we learn about this by sort of abstract knowledge. We can't just stay on this naive level of knowledge. So we need to investigate in detail.
One more thing I want to connect this to, because some of you may have seen some of my presentations where I talk about how, and I've talked about this on the show, how much there's this bias and sloppiness against fossil fuels and nuclear, and then for solar and wind. And why is that? And I think that this view of environment is a very deep cause, because solar and wind are viewed as natural. Now that doesn't actually stand up to scrutiny, but nevertheless, they are viewed as natural. And thus we have this view that, yeah, the goal should be to preserve nature, to preserve the non-human environment, and then the environment will take care of us. So people think, yeah, of course, if we use solar and wind, if we use more natural energy, yeah, of course, nature will be less mad at us and life will be positive in general. And there's no investigation of, well, how good are these, or there's very little serious investigation of how good are these at providing this energy that nature doesn't give us, because there's just not a focus on that. It's just, well, if we take care of the environment will take care of us. And this is just definitely not true, versus the idea, if we impact the environment will punish us. And so people think they can't see any of the positives of impacting the environment because it's just a dogma that it's bad. So those are all pushed to the side. But then any possible way in which nature changes is viewed as, oh, this is going to be the uh, the end of the world. So just that, if you wonder, okay, why are people so biased against this? It's ultimately that they think that it's the wrong thing at the core. By impacting nature, this is the wrong thing, and it's going to lead to bad things, and that leads to a blindness toward positives, or at least a minimization of them, and then this seeing way too much in terms of negatives, because really any impact is assumed to be negative, and thus the possibility of, oh, maybe it's better to have a greener and warmer planet from CO2, that's not even on people's minds, even though it's kind of an obvious possibility, since in general plant life likes more CO2 and humans like more warmth. But yet when people hear, oh, we're putting more CO2 in the atmosphere, they just think, oh, well, that's impacting the environment. And it's wrong to impact the environment. And if we impact the environment's going to punish us. So very interesting how this philosophy, this dogmatic view that's completely unscientific and deeply anti-human, is just infecting everyone's thinking. And I think it's basically almost universal. Certainly people in industry voice this view of environment all the time. And this is why I'm so emphatic about start thinking in terms of the human environment. Think of your surroundings from a human perspective, and then you're going to start valuing everything that industry does, including you're going to value it environmentally.